I'm assuming you all know that we're here to have a talk about the Wild of Blean project. So I'm going to be chatting a bit of an overview of the project, why we're doing what we're doing, a bit of the details, and some of our most recent project updates. And as mentioned, I am Alicia. So for those of you who might not know, the project is a partnership project between Kent Wildlife Trust that myself, Stan and Katie are from, and Wildwood Trust, who are a organisation that have a zoo with just native British wildlife right on the edge of the Blean. So it's a really perfect collaboration because Kent Wildlife Trust own that section of woodland, and then you have Wildwood right there, and they have a wealth of expertise in native species management. And Kent Wildlife Trust obviously have a huge amount of expertise in land management. So the two organisations come together with this really helpful partnership. So the overview, the aim of the project is restoration of complete natural processes to a lowland English woodland. In this case, the woodland we're talking about is West Blean and Thorndon Wood. Some of you might have been there before, some of you might not have been there before. It is just north of Canterbury, between sort of Canterbury and Whitstable and Herne Bay. And West Blean and Thorndon Wood is just one section of a wider landscape of native woodland that sort of encompasses the Blean landscape, which is one of the largest stretches of ancient woodland left in England. And so there are multiple objectives within our aim. One, that we introduce large herbivores to the woodland as natural engineers. Two, that we have a more biodiverse, more resilient ecosystem. That people are advocates for the project, and that we create a model for the rest of the UK based on international best practice. So what we do, we learn from others, and we help to develop and improve that best practice, and that others can learn from us and do similar projects again and better and build on that expertise. So this is a bit of an overview of a project timeline. And as you can see, we're sort of just over halfway through 2022. So for those of you who have potentially been following the project or have seen the news in the last couple of weeks, we just had a pretty significant project milestone, which is that 3 of our bison have arrived on site and are now exploring their new woodland home. And we'll talk in a bit more detail about that later on in the talk. But as you can see, this sort of very basic timeline shows you some of the big things that have been happening in the project. We've also had a huge amount of woodland management work. So that happened in a lot of the autumn and winter. We've also had a lot of on-site infrastructure being constructed in preparation for the animals arriving. And as we mentioned about that talk in 2 months' time, a huge amount of monitoring has been taking place to try and understand what is the woodland like now before these animals arrive, what are the species that are found there and what are the processes that are there, so we can understand what it's like now, so that once these animals have been there for a while, we can understand what it's like in the future and what changes they've made. So I'm not sure lots of you know this, but where is the Blean? We're talking about, as I mentioned, just between sort of Canterbury and the coast, right on the tip of the southeast of the UK, in what's a pretty densely populated part of the country. So this is a bit of a map of our project. So we've got our sections where bison will be found, which are these areas with the red dotty line. We've got other sections where these other animals will be found. So as well as introducing bison on site, we're also introducing longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, and Iron Age pigs. Within the bison areas, there will also be Iron Age pigs and Exmoor ponies. And then there's also this section over here that doesn't have any livestock. And we'll talk a bit of the why it's organised like this in a second. For those of you who know the area really well and want to sort of orientate yourself, this is Thorndon Wood Road running through here. So you sort of head this way to Whitstable and Herne Bay and down here to Canterbury. So this is a bit of an introduction to these animals. This is one of the bison at Wildwood, so not one of the bison that's currently in the Blean. I do have some footage of that to show you guys at the end, but just to give you a bit of a sense of scale of how big these animals are that we're talking about. So, as we mentioned, we've got our bison, our Exmoor ponies, longhorn cattle, and Iron Age pigs. And the reason we're introducing these 4 different animals is they all do slightly different things in the woodland. So you can see on the bottom left corner here, the bison is rubbing against this tree and some of the bark is coming off. So in effect, the bison is bark stripping the tree, and this can ring bark it. So if you remove the bark from all the way around the tree, that tree can die. So sometimes that leaves standing dead wood, and sometimes the tree falls over. And both of those things have real benefits for biodiversity. So standing deadwood is really popular for lots of bird species, and especially woodpeckers, but also fallen deadwood has a whole variety of other benefits, not only the deadwood itself, but the space it creates in the canopy and the light that then can reach the forest floor. Cattle and ponies also do different things. So for those who are sort of familiar with domesticated livestock, obviously cattle and ponies eat very differently, and that leads to different impacts in the environment. Similarly, pigs are obviously very different from the rest of these 3 animals because they're not herbivores. So again, we're talking about different impacts in the woodland. Pigs also do this really cool thing that's it's called rootling, but I don't know if rootling is actually a real word, but it's a fun word, so I'm going to go with it. But effectively, they turn over the soil with their little snout, which almost mimics the impact of a trowel in your garden. So all these animals do different things in the woodland. So we're talking about bringing back those ecosystem processes. These animals are doing those different components for us. So, and I'll talk about the why. Why on earth are we going about this project? So this is what the management of the Blean looked like sort of, well, the animals have arrived now, so let's say a year ago, previous to the animals' arrival. So we've got these different sections of the woodland with these different colour patches. And we're managing these different sections in the different colours in slightly different ways. So I'm just going to make your faces smaller so I can see the key. Here we go. So in our purple sections, we've got coppice. I'm sure some of you are really familiar what coppicing is, but effectively you have a tree, you cut it down, and that tree will regrow with multiple shoots rather than one shoot, and those, or one trunk rather, and those shoots are often quite straight and narrow, and that has been used for a really long time for a very useful source of wood for things like fence posts. We've also got these green patches. So Kent Wildlife Trust has owned West Blean and Thorndon Wood for a couple of decades now, but prior to that, it was owned by a bank, and the bank used it as effectively a commercial crop plantation in which they planted non-native pine trees. The pine trees grew, they chopped them down, and then they can sell that timber for profit. And this has very, 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 very little benefits for biodiversity. If anything, it's harmful. And so in the time that Kent Wildlife Trust has owned the woodland, we've been progressively removing those non-native pines and allowing native trees to regrow. And so you can see in the sort of light tealy kind of colour, greeny blue colour, but native regenerations, that's native tree species regrowing. So we've got these different sections being managed slightly differently, and we're often managing different sections for certain species. I've got some images of what that looks like. So this is coppicing with these straight branches. We've got those non-native pine trees, and they often create a really dense, dark woodland, which is not very helpful for much wildlife. And so, I'm just going to go back one. And so these different types of woodland management we've been doing for decades and have been able to keep hold of the biodiversity that we have on site. However, we're asking ourselves now, is this working? So traditional woodland management looks like you have trees in your woodland, and various components mean that, so you might have wind or fire or chainsaws in the form of people, and then your cycle continues. And that tries to maintain different habitats, so woodland canopy as well as open spaces for different species. However, this requires a lot of human management, a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resource. So again, we're asking, is this the best thing to do? And so a report a couple of years ago found that woodland management was one of the greatest drivers of species loss in the UK. And so again, we're asking ourselves, is our current woodland management the most effective way of looking after biodiversity on the site? And we also know alongside this that we're facing a huge environmental, biodiversity and climate crisis. These photos are from when I was giving this talk last summer, where we had a mass flash flooding in London. And I could probably replace these photos now with photos of the really high temperatures we've been experiencing this summer. You can see sort of almost the two sides of the many different sides of climate change, of one year having these huge dangerous flood events, and another year having these very dangerous heat wave events. So we know we've got these problems. We've got biodiversity loss, biodiversity crisis, and we've got a climate crisis. So instead of us managing the woodland, we're going to try something different. We're going to introduce these animals and we're going to try and get them to manage the woodland for us. So we have our trees doing their thing, often quite a dense closed canopy. That's one type of habitat that can support some species. And we introduce our bison, and we talked earlier about how bison can ring bark trees. So they can remove the bark around some of those trees, which can cause that tree to die. And then new plants grow. So now we have different habitat types. We've got the tree canopy, but we also have these other plants that aren't trees growing. And then the cycle kind of continues, and trees grow and bison remove other trees. And what makes it quite different from people is we often behave in quite a regimented way. We have sections of the woodland that we manage in different ways. Bison don't operate like that. They do their own thing. And so one year they'll be eating bark over there, and another year they're doing something over there. And so they behave in a far more random way, which creates a far more dynamic environment. And so you end up with a mosaic of different habitats rather than just one type of habitat or another type of habitat. You end up with greater diversity. So the hope being that with this greater diversity, this greater mosaic, you have more, we add bison, and you've got more types of plants and animals, so a greater diversity, but also a greater amount. So higher amounts means more abundance. We're talking about a greater biodiversity and a greater bioabundance on this site. So, I went too far. If we remember our original map of what the site looks like now, instead of all those different sections, we've got our bison section, which also has those Iron Age pigs and Exmoor ponies. We've got the section with the Longhorn cattle, Iron Age pigs and Exmoor ponies. And then we have this other section of the side of the road, which I said had no animals. And so on this section, we're going to be continuing with that human woodland management. And the idea of this is that we can compare these three zones. So we've got our bison assemblage, we've got our proxy assemblage, and proxy is just a funny word, really. This is just what our livestock is. Then we have our no grazing. And so this is sort of widely regarded as the best method for trying to test sort of what works. And so I mentioned we've also done a significant baseline survey before the bison arrived. And the monitoring team will be continuing to monitor over the next many years to see what does the plants and animals and also the processes look like in the bison assemblage, the proxy assemblage, and the no grazing compartment. And then we can see what is best for this woodland. And we're pretty confident that the bison are going to do things in the woodland that are far more beneficial for biodiversity and bioabundance than we're able to achieve by human management. And that's what the evidence suggests that's coming out of Europe, where projects have operated like this for longer than we have. So just a bit more detail about that monitoring program. Cora and her team are monitoring everything you could possibly think of, to be honest. Vegetation, breeding bird surveys, bugs, invertebrates, bats, dormice, reptiles, butterflies, soil, many things. And it's not just Cora. She has sort of a team of people, but also working in collaboration with lots of other organizations who have teams of volunteers who go out and monitor at this site. So this is a huge effort and is far greater scale of monitoring than we're normally able to achieve on nature reserves, which is an amazing opportunity for learning new stuff. And we've learned so much, even just from the baseline survey. So it's a brilliant opportunity sort of in its own right. My mouse has gone to sleep now. It's back. So just some of the sort of quite exciting stuff that they've discovered just in this first year. So not even yet looking at the impact of these animals. Graham Lyons, who is a incredibly talented invertebrate specialist, as well as many other things, has been out on site and has found multiple species that haven't been found in the UK for quite a while, sort of showing that they've been sort of hiding in the Blean and no one knew, which is quite exciting. There are the Latin names on these species. I can never pronounce them, so I will leave you to read them. So something else that we monitor a lot is the heath fritillary. This is the species that the Blean is really known for. And it will be quite interesting to see what the impact of the bison is. So heath fritillary are often found on some of the rides that we create in the woodland, and the rides are sort of paths where more sunlight can get to the forest floor, and the fritillaries really like them. And so as the bison potentially open up the canopy in places that we haven't been able to, maybe we're going to see more heath fritillary there. So just a few other project updates. That has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the basics of the why of the project and the what we're doing. And this is just a couple of our updates from now, really. So we have bison, which I'll show you guys in a second, but just a few other bits and bobs. We also have a corral handling system. So this is basically a system of fences and gates in a relatively small area, which we can use to be able to handle the bison if and when needed. For example, if we need, when the team, so this is Tom and Don, our bison rangers, this is them in the Netherlands. If when they needed to attach the collars to the bison, they could do that with having the bison in the corral. So these guys joined our team quite a few months ago now. I'm not going to remember when. Feels like they've been there forever. And they went to the Netherlands to gather as much knowledge as possible about some of the projects out there that have been going for quite a few years, decades, and are very successful in bringing that back to us. We have sourced our bison, and 3 of those are on site. And we have ready and waiting in the wings our longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, and pigs. So we were just chatting about the corral. This is the corral being unloaded at the Wildwood car park. It's very interesting that it had to be sort of built in Canada, where they are far more familiar and used to managing these large animals and have this kind of expertise. And we need to develop that expertise in-house now, which is really exciting. So we mentioned a little bit about that site management. So a huge amount of infrastructure took place sort of from autumn to winter that we've just had, in particular installing the fencing. So the bison are enclosed within an electric fence, and then there is also an additional 2-meter fence. And this in particular is to stop people being able to access the electric fence. The bison are easily stopped by the electric. And the fencing is super cool. It's able to, if it stopped working or something happened, it's all connected. So Tom and Don and the team would receive a notification on their phone that the fencing isn't working, and so they'd be able to go and intervene. They also check it every single day. So even if, for whatever reason, we will know if anything is awry. But as well as that fencing, there is also fencing surrounding the entire woodland, which is a shorter fence, 1 point something meters, and that will keep in those Exmoor ponies, longhorn cattle, and Iron Age pigs. So as well as installing those bits and bobs, there's also been our annual woodland management. So every year we manage the woodland, whether that's coppicing or removing those pine trees. So there was quite a lot of that work took place from autumn to winter. So if you've been on site, you've probably seen the contractors getting work done. The site's got a lot less going on now as we're into summer, but they did an amazing job on a huge site with a huge amount of work. So we also have a whole host of education and engagement things going on, from work with forest schools, work with older students on their GCSEs and A-levels. We do online talks, such as talking with you guys. And we also, quite excitingly, have a whole new suite of interpretation at the site. So this includes signage and new way markers. Some of you who might have been to the site before, it is sometimes a bit easy to get lost in. So we try to strike a balance between having some signage so people can find their way, but not overloading people, because you still want to be able to, or lots of people want to be able to go into the woodland and feel like they're in a woodland and not surrounded by stuff. So we try to strike a balance between that level of information, but also providing sort of quiet and calm space. And most recently, we held a festival on site celebrating the arrival of these animals. So, trying to remember if it is the next slide. Yes, it is. So, the most exciting thing that has very recently happened was the arrival of these animals into the Blean. So they arrived and they were in the corral, and then we released them from the corral. So we have our matriarch, who's from Scotland, and then 2 younger females who are from Fotterin Island. And it's really important that the matriarch is able to sort of be one of the first to sort of explore their new environment as the older female, and lead the herd. And then the bull, the 4th animal, he'll arrive a bit later. So she has time to really get comfortable and establish that this is her herd and her space, because she's the matriarch. You can also see in this sort of snapshot one of the collars around their neck. So the matriarch has a collar and one of the younger females has a collar. So I'm going to hope that this YouTube works. So, wonder how. That was the animals being released from the corral and making their way into the woodland. I'm trying to work out how I move on from YouTube, but it seems, aha! So we had the animals were in their corral, and now they're in what we call a soft release area. So it's a slightly smaller section of the woodland than they'll normally have to roam around. And this just gives them a bit of time in a smaller area to get used to the environment. So the team can also make sure that they're happy and they're doing okay before they're released into a wider area. And so at that moment, we had the animals had been, we had words are failing. Right, the animals were being released from the corral, and then quite a way back past the fence line, we had some representatives of the press, as well as the project team. So you could probably hear the sort of cameras clicking because the person who was filming was next to a photographer. And so we've received a huge amount of press, and the KWT and Wildwood Comms team have been working absolutely flat out, which has been sort of phenomenal for the project to be able to get this sort of kind of coverage and be able to spread our message to so many organizations, particularly press that wouldn't necessarily previously have been interested in such a project. We're now getting a far broader range of people interested, which is amazing to sort of start talking about this project and spreading this message to as wide an audience as possible. And hopefully these are the people who are now going to help and support us long term in the project. So my mouse has now disappeared. It's back. So lastly, just before we end and go to the Q&A, just going to talk a little bit about how you can get involved. So we always need volunteers. We mentioned a little bit how Cora's monitoring effort has been hugely supported by volunteers, from those counting butterflies, plants, bugs, you name it. A volunteer is probably counting a bit of wildlife in the Blean. We also need volunteers to help us in our people engagement side of things, whether that's helping us with school groups or being on site and helping us support people who come and visit the site. You can come to an event. So we run quite a few of them. We recently held a bison festival in the Blean celebrating the arrival of these animals. You can donate to the project, and you can tell somebody about the project. So spreading the message about what this project is trying to achieve, and how we can do this project locally in Kent, and that hopefully it can have these broad-ranging impacts, is really amazing, and about how we can all collectively fight the climate and biodiversity crisis.